Hello, fellow VITA volunteers, and welcome to the Volunteer Standards of Conduct training, which covers ethics. The information here can also be found in IRS Publication 4961. This slideshow will help you be ready to take the Volunteer Standards of Conduct exam. What? You say? An exam already? Don't worry. The exam is only 10 multiple choice, mostly common sense questions that you can view ahead of time in IRS Publication 6744. And it's open book. Also, if you are beginning these trainings in early fall, you will have some time before the IRS opens the current year exams, which usually happens in October or November. But I always suggest looking at last year's exam, as those questions will help you prepare, and you will get a confidence boost when you see the kind of questions on the exam. All right then, let's get started. The IRS spec, or IRS Stakeholder Partnerships Education and Communication, we'll just refer to them as IRS spec from here on, defines unethical behavior as not conforming to agreed standards of moral conduct, especially within a particular profession. But they go on to explain that in most cases, unethical behavior is acted upon with the intent to disregard the established laws, procedures, or set policies. So that means unethical action is not a mistake. So if this is your first time doing taxes for a client and you're a little nervous about making mistakes, just know that as long as you are honest and you are conscientious in what you're doing, you're not going to get yourself in trouble. So publication 4961 gives us this example, and we get to figure out whether Mary gets to keep her head. If volunteer Mary prepares a return which includes a credit the taxpayer does not qualify for because Mary did not understand the law, Mary did not act unethically. However, if Mary knowingly allowed a credit for which the taxpayer did not qualify, Mary committed an unethical act and violated the volunteer standards of conduct. And if you don't know what a credit is yet, don't worry, we'll cover that later. Just know that not understanding is not unethical. We, of course, want to prepare accurate returns, and we have a certain scope and training that helps us stay within the limits of our knowledge base. But there's a difference between a mistake and unethical behavior. As VITA volunteers, we have 6 volunteer standards of conduct that we are going to follow that help us stay ethical. So number 1 is that we are going to follow the quality site requirements. More on those later. Number 2, we are not going to accept payment or solicit donations or accept refund payments for federal or state return preparation from customers. Number 3, we will not solicit business from taxpayers that we're assisting or use the information that we might be gaining, that private information about them, for any direct or indirect personal benefit for ourselves or any other specific individuals. Number 4, we will not knowingly prepare false returns, just like in Mary's case. Number 5, we will not engage in criminal, infamous, dishonest, notoriously disgraceful conduct or any other conduct deemed to have a negative effect on VITA or tax counseling for the elderly programs. And number 6, we are going to treat all taxpayers in a professional and courteous, respectful manner. Now I know what you're thinking. We just had a slide with 6 things on it, and now you've got a slide with 10 more things on it for me to remember? Don't worry, I'm trying to minimize this as much as possible, but we do have 10 quality site requirements. The first is certification. At the very least, to be volunteers with VITA, we all need to be certified with the Volunteer Standards of Conduct course and the Intake, Interview, and Quality Review course, which, as we talked about, the exams are pretty straightforward, and I know we are all going to be able to do that, so don't worry about it. For process, VITA sites have a specific process for ensuring that each return is done accurately and by a preparer whose certification matches the skills needed to prepare that return. Every return will begin with an intake form, Form 13614C, which is a form number that you are going to be very familiar with by the end of training. We will talk about it a lot. This format is filled out by the client, sometimes with the preparer and sometimes ahead of time, and it acts as an organizer to help us know what to ask and to guide the return preparation process. And every return gets a second set of eyes on it during the quality review process. We will cover the entire process more in depth in our next slideshow, Intake, Interview, and Quality Review. We also need to ensure that we have a photo identification for each taxpayer. So that might be 1 for a single taxpayer or 2 for married filing joint taxpayers. And if you don't know what that means, we're going to cover it in some later slideshows. We also need proof of tax ID numbers, like a Social Security number, for all persons on the return. And if our taxpayers don't have a Social Security number, they might have another type of tax ID. Again, we'll talk more about that later. As for reference materials, we will have reference materials available on site. Usually they'll be located right at your workstation. They can also be accessed digitally online. And it's totally appropriate to look stuff up while you are preparing a return. Our main 2 resources will be Publication 17, which is the instructions to the 1040 or the personal tax return, and Publication 4012, which you should be getting familiar with, not memorizing, throughout our trainings. Publication 4012 also has a table towards the beginning that tells which forms and tax situations are in the scope of our program and which are out of scope. It also guides you on what certification you need to have in order to prepare a return. So this is a very important section as it helps us comply with that first quality site requirement we talked about, certification. You can also find some TaxSlayer input instructions in the 4012 as well as some select tax law information. The volunteer agreement, which is Form 13615, must be signed by each and every volunteer before they can go on site. It is just an agreement that states that you will follow all of the requirements that we are talking about in this slideshow. It will also show what level of certification you have passed. Timely filing is not as much something you as a preparer will be concerned about, but our site coordinators will be ensuring that after you finish preparing the return, it gets submitted to the IRS. And if for some reason the IRS doesn't accept that return, the site coordinators are responsible for notifying the client so that the client can then return to get that resolved. Civil rights just means that we are not going to discriminate or adopt discriminatory practices. And aside from, of course, the ethical imperative, we are partnered with the IRS, which is a governmental institution which is legally barred from discrimination. We will have a site identification number. You might remember entering it when you signed up for Link and Learn. We will also have an electronic filing number, which is not something you as a preparer need to worry about entering into returns. It will automatically populate in the software, but it does identify where that return was prepared. And lastly, of course, we are dealing with very private and sensitive information that we really need to be protective of. We want our clients to feel super safe and be super safe in trusting us with their tax return preparation. So our next standard of conduct is not accepting payment. And the publication 4961 gives us this example. You finish a time-consuming return and the client is very grateful. On her way out, the client stops by and tries to sneak you a $20 bill in your pocket, saying, "I would have paid 10 times that at the preparer across the street." So at that point, your job is to return the money and explain that you cannot accept money for doing taxes. But the center may appreciate a donation which can be made at the center's downtown office or via their website. And that last little bit is just to clarify that if we were accepting donations from our clients, we would have to be very clear about that our tax services are free, and so we would not be having donation jars in the tax preparation area at all. So for solicitation and use of information, we get 3 examples. Number 1 is pretty straightforward. You are a volunteer preparer and an accountant. You can't solicit business from the taxpayer. Number 2, it's helpful to know that some of the in-person sites have a specific site greeter. So in this case, you are the site's greeter. Your daughter asks you to take candy orders at the site for her school fundraiser. And at that point, you would have to explain to her that as a VITA TCE volunteer, you can't solicit personal business. Number 3, your primary business includes selling health insurance policies. During the interview, you find out the taxpayer lost access to health insurance in January of the current year. You cannot offer to sell the taxpayer health insurance through your business, even if you think it would be super helpful for them. And this also goes if it's your brother-in-law or somebody else you know. In some situations, we might need to send clients to a paid preparer. We won't be sending them to a specific paid preparer. If their return is out of scope for us, then we just recommend that they need to find a paid preparer to help them with their taxes for the year. Our next standard of conduct is not knowingly preparing false returns. And our little guy on the right there, he's in the pillory for perjury. So our example is a volunteer preparer told the taxpayer that cash income does not need to be reported. And if you're new to tax, that is not ever the case. Cash income does need to be reported. The return was completed without the cash income. The quality reviewer simply missed this omission and the return was printed, signed, and e-filed. In this case, the volunteer preparer who had gone through the certification process, and by the end of that, again, you know that cash income does need to be reported, violated the standard. However, since the quality reviewer did not knowingly allow this return to be e-filed incorrectly, the quality reviewer did not violate the standard. So again, remember, unethical action is different than a lack of knowledge or a simple mistake. And as much as we try to do our due diligence, which we'll talk about later, and prepare, accurate returns, if a mistake happens, that is not necessarily violating the ethical standard. Not engaging in criminal, infamous, dishonest, notoriously disgraceful conduct, and etc. So here's a couple of examples. A partner's program director was convicted of embezzling funds from an unrelated organization. The program director's criminal conduct created negative publicity for the partner, and the partner, which is like our club, was removed from the VITA TCE programs. Another example, a taxpayer's refund was stolen by a volunteer return preparer at a VITA site. The taxpayer sought monetary damages from the spec partner, again like our club, for the volunteer's fraudulent actions. And the volunteer preparer was banned from volunteering in VITA TCE programs. So here you can see that your behavior inside and outside our VITA program, our club, could affect not just you, but also the club as a whole. We are going to be professional, courteous, and respectful. The example is you finish a difficult return for Millie, who has self-employment income, several expenses, and very few records, which as a tax professional is frustrating. In addition, her son turned 25 and moved out early in the year, so she's not probably getting a credit that she thought she would be getting. She owes the IRS about $50. After you carefully explain the return, Millie sputters, "You don't know what you're doing. I always get a refund. My neighbor is self-employed and she got $1,900 back." So in this situation, take a deep breath and politely explain that every return is different. And if she's really emotionally worked up, then you might need to involve the site coordinator. And this is a something that I feel very passionate about, that we need to remember that our clients come in as human beings, and all sorts of things can have happened to them over the course of the year, and these things tend to come out in the taxes. You have people who have had divorces, they have lost loved ones, and they're preparing a final return for their loved ones. You have people who, they use some of these tax credits to support their family. They're making very low income, and in order to feed their children, they're counting on this. So when things don't come out as they expected, whether that was a right expectation or a wrong expectation, they can become emotional about this, and we need to remember that that expression of emotion is not necessarily a reflection of you or your skill. It's a reflection of the things that have happened to them as human beings. And so remaining respectful and courteous and helping them to get calm and understand their situation, it's just really important, and it's part of our customer service. So negligence sits in a middle ground between willful disregard for the tax laws and omissions because of lack of knowledge or because of lack of information. And that's where due diligence comes in. So generally speaking, you can rely in good faith on the information that your clients tell you, and you don't need documentation for everything. You do not need to audit your clients. But part of due diligence is that when you hear some information that maybe it doesn't make perfect sense, or there's some numbers that seem just a little odd, or I think the example in one of our practice problems on Lincoln Learn was an uncle claiming his nephew, and the uncle had pretty low income and no child care expenses. You might need to ask some further questions, like why aren't the parents claiming this child? Who takes care of the child while you're at work? And maybe everything is on the up and up, and the uncle stepped up in a really unfortunate situation where the parents passed away or aren't there for whatever reason, and another friend or relative takes care of the child while he's at work. But it does require that you just kind of gently ask for more information. And we can work on that too as we go through our trainings, how to ask for more information without sounding accusatory. Let's make it a conversation. However, if you get through this conversation and you are kind of cringing inside, like this does not seem right, something seems funny, you do not have to prepare this return. If you are wondering if it's just because you're new at this, you can always ask another preparer or another volunteer to come and have a look at this. What do you think? You can ask the site coordinator, but in the end, don't prepare a return that you don't feel comfortable with. Rehashing and extending a little your options for due diligence. You can again ask the site coordinator, ask another preparer. You can ask to reschedule. That was something that we did last year with a situation. I sent a client back to get more information. They didn't have the information with them, and so I asked, okay, can we reschedule? You get that information. I'll study up on this situation to make sure I understand correctly the law around this. So that's an option. We have our references again digitally. You'll be able to use the Publication 17 or 4012, or IRS.gov has access to all sorts of publications for all kinds of situations. You can call the hotline, 1-800-829-VITA. And you can advise the client to seek a paid preparer, which is often a good out for a return. That, if you've asked the coordinator and another preparer and we're all kind of feeling, something feels funny, we might just say, I think this is a situation where a paid preparer would better advise you. And sometimes, they need to see a paid preparer because their situation is out of scope, and it's not because we're uncomfortable with the return. It's just that we can't do the return through our program. But those are our options. Now that we've discussed our 6 standards of conduct, here are the consequences for not complying. We could be removed from all VITA TCE programs. So if you didn't comply, you could not just not be able to volunteer with our club, but you also wouldn't be able to volunteer with, say, the local AARP organization, which also provides tax services through TCE. Inclusion in the IRS volunteer registry, which doesn't sound bad, but it's bad. That would bar future VITA TCE activity indefinitely, so not just one season, not just next season, indefinitely. And if you moved away and tried to volunteer somewhere else, the IRS would know about you. It could also result in deactivation of the sponsoring partner's site electronic filing ID number, which the sponsoring partner is our club. So if we didn't have that number, we couldn't file any returns. It would make us useless. If we're borrowing any supplies or equipment from the IRS, for instance, physical sites, loans, laptops, and things like that, all of that could be taken away. The sponsoring partner's relationship with the IRS, so again, our club's relationship with the IRS could be terminated. If we were receiving any grant funds, which we aren't right now, but who knows, maybe in the future, the funds would be terminated. Referral of your conduct for potential TIGTA, which is short for Treasury Inspector General for Tax Administration and Criminal Investigations. So again, filing a false return, it's criminal, and you can be prosecuted for that. I just want to point out that the alternative text to this picture was a group of people in a room, which I feel like understates the action of the scene. Now, if you were to see a breach of ethics, there is an external referral process, and it begins by sending an email to wi.voltax@irs.gov. So again, if you see a problem, there is a way to report it. As we begin to wrap things up for this session, I really want to leave you with a positive note. Remember, a mistake or a simple misunderstanding of the law is not the same as a breach of ethics. And as volunteers, we are protected under the Volunteer Protection Act of 1997. So as long as you act within the scope of your responsibility, so within the scope of our program, within the scope of your certification, you're not doing crazy returns. As long as you're trained, which is what we're working on, as long as you're certified, which you will be by the time we start, and as long as you don't commit willful, criminal, reckless, grossly negligent, conscious, flagrantly indifferent acts, we're going to be okay, and we are going to provide a service that really helps our community.